Imagine a world map. Now imagine coloring in every piece of land that was once part of the British Empire. You would need a lot of red paint. By the early 1920s, the British Empire was the largest in history. It was truly enormous. It covered about a quarter of the Earth's total land area. Think about that for a moment. 1 in every 4 people on the planet lived under British rule. From the vast plains of Canada to the sun-scorched deserts of Australia, the Union Jack flew high. It was an empire built on trade, conquest, exploration, stretching across every single continent. This colossal empire was often described with a famous phrase, "The empire on which the sun never set." This wasn't just a poetic saying, it was literally true. Because its territories were spread all around the globe, it was always daytime somewhere in the British Empire. When the sun was setting on the islands of the Caribbean, it was rising over the great cities of India. This global reach gave Britain incredible power and influence. The sheer diversity of the empire was staggering. But history teaches us that no empire lasts forever. It's a dramatic and powerful story of change. Long before the empire reached its greatest size, it suffered its first major and shocking loss. This was the loss of the American colonies. In the 18th century, Britain had 13 prosperous colonies along the east coast of North America. These colonies were full of British people who had crossed the Atlantic for a new life. They felt British, they spoke English, they were loyal to the king, but things started to go wrong. The British government based far away in London needed money, especially after fighting expensive wars like the 7 Years' War against France. To raise this money, the government decided to tax the American colonists. They introduced taxes on things like sugar paper and most famously tea. This made the colonists very angry. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, so they felt they had no say in these new laws. Their famous slogan was "No taxation without representation." They believed it was unfair to be taxed by a government in which they had no voice. The famous Boston Tea Party, where colonists threw British tea into the harbour, was a powerful act of defiance. The British government responded with force, sending soldiers to keep order. In 1775, the American War of Independence began. In the end, the impossible happened. The American colonists won. In 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. After the shock of losing America, Britain entered a period of incredible expansion. The 19th century, often called the Victorian era after Queen Victoria, was the high point of British imperial power. Britain's Industrial Revolution gave it a huge advantage. Factories produced goods that could be sold all over the world. The powerful Royal Navy protected trading ships and sea lanes. This industrial and naval power let Britain expand into every corner of the globe. Large parts of Africa were mapped, explored and claimed. The scramble for Africa. Britain took control of Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. In Asia, it strengthened its grip on India, the so-called jewel in the crown. It expanded in Southeast Asia, Malaya, modern Malaysia, Singapore. Britain responded by creating the Dominion status. Yet, ideas of independence and self-rule persisted. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi emerged in India, challenging British rule. On the surface, the empire looked permanent, but beneath it, nationalism was gathering force to challenge the old order. The First World War, which raged from 1914 to 1918, was a turning point for the British Empire. When Britain declared war on Germany, the entire empire went to war alongside it. Millions of soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India and Africa traveled across the world to fight for the empire. They fought in the muddy trenches of France, the deserts of the Middle East, the mountains of Italy. Their contribution was immense and absolutely vital to the Allied victory. However, the war came at a terrible cost. Britain lost nearly 1 million soldiers and millions more were wounded. The country was left with huge debts. It was no longer the world's undisputed economic powerhouse. The United States was now rising to take that position. The war also changed the way people in the colonies saw themselves and the empire. They began to ask a difficult question. If they were good enough to die for the empire, why were they not good enough to rule themselves? The Great War had been won, but in winning it, the British Empire had been fatally weakened. No single event symbolizes the end of the British Empire more than the independence of India. For centuries, India was the most important, most populous, most valuable part of the empire. The campaign for India's freedom had been building for decades, led by the inspirational figure of Mahatma Gandhi. He promoted a powerful and unique strategy of non-violent civil disobedience. Gandhi's methods were brilliant. Instead of fighting with weapons, Indians fought with protests, boycotts, marches. They refused to buy British goods. They marched to the sea to make their own salt in defiance of a British tax, and they willingly went to prison for their beliefs. This strategy captured the world's attention and made it very difficult for the British to respond with force without looking like tyrants. By the end of the Second World War, Britain was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. The British government, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, accepted the inevitable. It was decided that India would be granted its independence. On August 15, 1947, British rule in India ended. This division, known as partition, was a human catastrophe. The independence of India sent a clear signal across the rest of the empire, especially in Africa. If India could win its freedom, why not them? In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan gave a famous speech in South Africa. He spoke of a wind of change blowing through the continent. This speech was a public admission that the era of colonial rule was ending. Instead, it would manage a process of peaceful transition to independence. The process began in West Africa. Ghana, 1957. Kwame Nkrumah, hero of independence movements, Nigeria, 1960. One by one, Britain's African colonies became new nations. Sierra Leone, 1961. Tanganyika, 1961, now part of Tanzania. Uganda, 1962. Kenya, 1963. The map of Africa was being redrawn at an incredible speed. While many transitions were peaceful, some were not. But the direction of history was clear. By the end of the 1960s, the vast majority of Britain's once huge African empire had disappeared, replaced by a continent of proud and independent nations. While the world's attention was often focused on the huge changes in India and Africa, the process of decolonization was also transforming other parts of the British Empire. The beautiful islands of the Caribbean, which were among Britain's oldest colonies, also began their journey towards independence. For centuries, these islands had been dominated by sugar plantations and were strategically important in the age of sail. But by the mid-20th century, their people were also demanding the right to govern themselves. The movement towards independence in the Caribbean happened in a series of waves. Jamaica led the way. Independence 1962. Trinidad and Tobago. Independence 1962. Their success inspired others across the region. Barbados, Independence 1966. Grenada, Dominica, St. Lucia. Each new flag that was raised symbolized another step in the dismantling of the old imperial structure. In the Mediterranean, Cyprus became independent in 1960. Malta became independent in 1964. The empire that had taken centuries to build had essentially disappeared in the space of just a few decades. There was one last very significant act to come in the story of Britain's empire. This was the handover of Hong Kong to China. Britain had gained control of Hong Kong Island in 1842 after the First Opium War. Later in the 19th century, it also gained a 99-year lease on a larger area known as the New Territories. For over 150 years, Hong Kong was a British colony. It grew from a small fishing village into one of the world's most dynamic and successful financial centers. As the end of the 99-year lease approached in 1997, negotiations had to take place with the government of China. Unlike other colonies that became independent, Hong Kong's future was different. It stated that Hong Kong would be returned to China under a principle called One Country, Two Systems. On the night of June 30th, 1997, a spectacular ceremony was held in Hong Kong. In the pouring rain, the British flag was slowly lowered for the last time and the Chinese flag was raised. For many, the handover of Hong Kong was the final symbolic end of the British Empire. Today, on September 16th, 2025, Britain is a very different country from the one that ruled a quarter of the globe. It is a medium-sized European nation, an island nation once again. The loss of its empire forced Britain to find a new place and a new identity in the world. This was not an easy process. For decades, the country struggled with questions about its role. Was it still a global power? What was its relationship with Europe? What did it mean to be British without an empire to define it? The journey has been complex and is still ongoing. One of the most important legacies of the empire is the Commonwealth of Nations. This is a voluntary association of 56 independent countries, most of which were once part of the British Empire. It is not an empire. Britain has no power over the other members. Instead, it is a unique family of nations that share historical ties, the English language, and certain values like democracy and human rights. The Commonwealth allows Britain to maintain friendships and connections across the globe. The empire also profoundly changed Britain itself. The country today is a diverse, multicultural society. Walking through any major British city today, you will see the legacy of empire not on a map, but in the faces of the people who call Britain home.